primer conferenciante es el profesor Christopher Storrs. Voy a hacer una presentación muy breve sobre su investigación para aquellos que no le conocéis. El profesor Storrs trabaja sobre todo el mundo moderno, España en el mundo moderno. En particular se ha centrado, su último libro trataba sobre Felipe V y el resurgimiento de Spanish Resurgence, sobre el resurgimiento del poder español en el siglo XVIII. Previamente publicó un libro sobre Carlos II, que ha tenido una traducción al español, La resistencia de la monarquía hispánica, 1665-1700. Junto a este interés en la monarquía hispánica, en ese tránsito del siglo XVII al siglo XVIII, también se ha interesado por la dinastía Saboya y por los territorios regidos por la dinastía de Saboya en Italia. Y entre sus proyectos actuales trabaja sobre la deuda pública y privada en el Estado moderno y sobre lo que se llama en inglés el Fiscal Military State, o sea, el Estado fiscal y militar. Y sin más, le voy a dar la palabra para que nos dé su conferencia de hoy. Y normalmente, como ahora mismo lo que tenemos, antes teníamos 4 horas, ahora solo tenemos 3 horas para estas charlas, lo que vamos a hacer, el profesor va a dar su conferencia, haremos un receso de 5 o 10 minutos muy breve, después tendremos al segundo conferenciante y finalmente tendremos todo el turno de debate. Si después de la conferencia del profesor Storrs hay alguna pregunta directa, o sea, alguna cosa con alguna duda concreta, la hacemos entonces, pero si se trata de preguntas más generales, de debate y reflexiones más generales, las dejamos para el debate final, si os parece. Así que, sin más, le damos la palabra al profesor Storrs. Muchísimas gracias.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking you for inviting me to speak at your conference today, this afternoon. Great honor for me. Unfortunately, I must apologize for not being with you in person. This is due to the continued COVID pandemic here in Britain and the decision of my university to ban all but essential foreign travel. Unfortunately, for administrators here, research abroad is not considered as essential foreign travel. I particularly regret not being able to visit Seville, which I last visited to do research in Casa Pilatos in the Medina Theli archive many years ago. Returning to Seville would be an opportunity to see again what a splendid city it is, but also to meet again and chat with some of you whom I have met in Madrid, at Simancas and elsewhere. There will be other opportunities for this, I hope. I also regret not being able to visit Seville because it would be an opportunity for me to explore local archives, including the Archivo General de Indias, with a view to exploring the subject of my paper today, the political culture of Spain in the reign of the last Habsburg, Carlos II. In the last 2 years, I, like many of you, I think, have been able to do little more than reread transcriptions and photocopies acquired over many years in Madrid and at Simancas, and from other local archives in Spain, as well as some further material found on Paris, and to think a little more about what that material reveals. To revisit that material is, of course, not such a bad thing to do, so that there is something to be grateful to the lockdown for, that is, going over old material not read for many years. I've also been doing a little reading about English history in the later 17th century, in part because it was available, accessible, and we as researchers have to adapt to the circumstances we find ourselves in. We have to be flexible. But also, reading this English material, I was making a virtue of necessity in order to get some sort of comparative perspective on the Spain of Carlos II. I hope that you will think that in adopting the comparative method recommended by that great annal historian Mark Bloch, I have spent my time well. One final point. I must apologize to you for speaking today in English. After so many years visiting Spain, reading Spanish manuscripts and books, watching Telediario, and meeting and chatting with Spaniards, my Spanish ought to be much better than it is. But sadly, it is not, and I ask you to indulge me. I hope that these opening words of mine have enabled you to get used to my voice, my English, my intonation, my pronunciation, so that it will be a little bit easier for you. Now, I've already said something about method. Manuel Herrero explained to me that the focus of these seminars is method. So I thought it might also help to explain the origin of my paper. I've long been working, as Natalia explained, on the reign of Carlos II, although recently I've been thinking about a bigger study of the long-term evolution of what we know as the Spanish Antiguo Régimen and the place in it of the reign of Carlos II. More narrowly, in 2019, I co-authored with Raffaella Pilo of the University of Cagliari in Sardinia an introduction to a collection of short studies of a number of councillors of state appointed by Carlos II towards the end of 1699, and which was published in the journal Espacio, Tiempo y Forma. In that introduction, we very briefly articulated some ideas in response to both more recent developments in the historiography, and here I have in mind the notion of the polycentric monarchy, but also an older historiography regarding the Spanish nobility in the early modern era, and more specifically, the later 17th century. And finally, but by no means last, in explaining the origins of this research paper, during the lockdown, I read a collection of essays published in 2017 in honor of Richard Kagan. This is entitled The Early Modern Hispanic World, Transnational and Interdisciplinary Approaches, edited by Kimberly Lynn and Erin Rowe. In his contribution to that collection, John Eliot, J.H. Eliot, praises the contributors and their mainly cultural approaches. But he also comments on the lack of essays in that collection on the politics of Habsburg Spain. He goes on to suggest that we need a new synthesis of that political history. His observation reflects the fact that the political history, narrowly conceived political history, of early modern Spain has been relatively ignored in recent decades, although it has, of course, been reinterpreted in interesting ways by historians like Ruth Mackay, reading traditional and well-known sources in a way we might call reading against the grain, for example, in her book, The Limits of Royal Authority, published in 1999. My paper is perhaps better titled Aspects of Spanish Political Culture in the Reign of Carlos II, because there are a great many subjects which you might be expecting me to discuss, but which I am not going to say anything about, although what I say may have implications for them. So I'm not going to talk about the minority of Carlos II and regency of Mariana of Austria, or about the role of Carlos II's two consorts, or about the foral or neo-foral system, or finally about the system of valimiento. Instead, I want to look at some general characteristics of the political life of the reign. I ought also, I think, to explain my use or understanding of the concept of political culture, because as I'm sure you're aware, misunderstandings about concepts and their meanings can be a source of great confusion in our research. I use the term in the singular, culture, not cultures, because I don't want to get into a confusing discussion of plural or contrasting cultures. I'm using the term political culture essentially as a very basic way to describe the framework within which politics is conducted. I'm also, I'm using it essentially, my focus is a means to explore political stability. And now this is because any political history of Habsburg Spain and the reign of Carlos II ought, I think, to acknowledge the remarkable political stability which characterized Carlos II's Spain. Now, you might be surprised by that assertion. After all, the reign appears to be one punctuated, marked by a succession of episodes which are remarkable examples of instability. The fall of Nittard in 1669, Don Juan of Austria's seizure of power in 1676-77, toppling Valenzuela, what Henry Cayman has called the first military coup in Spain, and the Madrid riots of 1699. However, these episodes seem to me to be superficial, mere surface froth, as the annal historians dismiss most events in the past. The Spain of Carlos II certainly contrasts markedly with, for example, the England of King Charles II. The Restoration regime of 1660 lurched from crisis to crisis. The Popish plot and exclusion crisis of the 1670s, when some in England feared civil war. And at the end of the 1680s, Charles II's brother, James II, faced what we call the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And after that, James's successor, King William III, faced, as head of a revolutionary government, the constant threat of domestic Jacobite revolt and foreign invasion. It seems to me this is a marked contrast to the Spain of Carlos II. Similarly, the Dutch Republic almost collapsed in 1672 in the wake of foreign invasion, when political upset was accompanied by the murder of the De Witt brothers. Nothing of the sort happened in the Spain of Carlos II, where ministers who fell from power were merely banished from court, and where there was not the widespread purge of local officials of the sort associated with changes of regime in England before England or Britain achieved stability in the era of Robert Walpole. Of course, there were ups and downs. Stability was more obvious at some times than at others in Spain. So, for example, the 1680s, the decade of Medina Celi, appears to me the most stable in the reign of Carlos II. But more important is that basic stability, which was founded on, but also underpinned, Spain's political culture under Carlos II. Now, that stability is often seen through the lens of what is called foralism or neo-foralism. But I think that is too narrow, too simplistic a focus, especially where the implication is relations simply between Madrid, or rather Castile, and the territories of the Crown of Aragon, and maybe the foral peripheral territories more broadly. too narrow because Castile itself, indeed all the territories of the global monarchy, comprised a great many foral, and by that I simply mean privileged, communities whose traditional privileges were being constantly reshaped and negotiated throughout the Ancien Regime, the Antiguo Régimen. The existence of and respect for those privileges by ministers ensured a basic confidence and trust between, for example, the town councillors of Burgos and ministers in Madrid. Something evident in the minutes of the meetings of the regidores of Burgos in Carlos II's reign. There was nothing here of the sort of distrust, suspicion between the political nation on the one hand and the ministers and the crown on the other, which dogged the politics of Restoration England. Nor was Spain troubled by the religious issues which so divided English and, dare I say it, I live in Scotland, Scottish society at the time. On the whole, the political culture of Spain, and I think we can broaden this out to society across the global Spanish monarchy, was broadly, and I accept that I'm speaking very, very broadly here, integrated and loyal. So political culture, as I've already said, I'm using the term here as essentially a means to describe the broad framework within which politics happened in Carlos II's Spain. That is the mixture of formal institutions and laws, the attitudes or mentality, to use the anal expression, the conventions, customs and practices within which politics was conducted. Politics was simply the forging of policy, including the struggle for power within that framework. Now, there are various ways, I think, of looking at that culture. The traditional focus in the reign of Carlos II, in part because there seemed to be few alternatives, is the royal court. The focus of what until quite recently has been the most frequently consulted and cited work on the reign, the work now quite old of the Duque de Maura. There are good reasons for this focus on the court. After all, the Castilian Cortes was not summoned, although of course it, or rather the relatively small number of Castilian voting towns, were frequently consulted on, for example, the prorogation of the millones, or to secure approval of breaches of the conditions of the millones grants. The court, of course, was also the residence of the many foreign diplomats, and there were a lot of them in Madrid, whose reports are so useful to us, but whose reports perhaps distort our perception. Now, I'm going to come back to the court a little bit later, but I just want to identify some other locations or sites of political activity. So we have clashes within the ruling councils of the Cortes voting towns, clashes between those towns, for example, Seville, and their subordinate communities, the communities within their jurisdiction, over all sorts of issues, not least the distribution of taxation. Now, these are political venues, but what about issues? Now, one of the, we might look for debate about foreign policy issues. But I must say at this point that my reading of the town council minutes of Burgos, of Murcia, and of Valladolid suggests the primacy of local issues. Local politics is about local issues. But on the whole, foreign policy issues were never a source of contention in the way, say, that they were in the Parliament in Restoration England, where war against the absolute Catholic France of Louis XIV was a fiercely divisive issue. Now, this raises further interesting questions. What did the global monarchy mean to most Spaniards? Some communities, some families had connections. Some towns and cities had interests across the monarchy, inside and outside Europe. But whether this was the case for the great majority of Spain's population is something we might want to consider. And by the way the history of Spain and Spanish America are traditionally taught in the Spanish universities, I think prevents us from seeing links between Spain and Spanish America. Now, I want now to turn to attitudes, what the now historians call mentalité. And among the issues which I think is really difficult for us to explore is opinion, public opinion. Now, quite apart from the challenges associated with the conceptualization or definition of opinion, are those of thinking about how we then go on to explore it. Historians of 17th century Spain have long been interested in the extensive satirical and related material generated during the reign of Carlos II and before it. But while there has some excellent work been done on this material and on efforts to what we might term rebranding of Carlos II, that is to put out propaganda in favor of the king and his image, the exact significance of this material remains in most respects unclear. Much attention has been devoted to the content of these satirical publications, but far less to its reception and its impact on attitudes and behavior. It may well be that despite all the attention devoted to it, this material has not undermined that fundamental loyalty and stability I referred to earlier. And we need more research into this topic, and we need to refine the method for evaluating the source material and its impact. We need to find out about how far beyond Madrid this material reached and how it was read and responded to, drawing on private correspondence, diaries, and so on. The reports of the corregidores, in Seville, of course, the assistente, might provide some information here, but ideally we would discover a Spanish Samuel Pepys or John Evelyn, whose diaries would offer us a fascinating insight into the late 17th century Spanish mind. The same problem, of course, applies to sermons, the sermons delivered in church, which have also been honed in on as offering us an insight into political attitudes and the way they are molded. We also need to identify other means of getting at mentalities, at mindsets or attitudes. During the lockdown, I looked over a number of consultas of the Council of State, hoping to find out what they revealed of the ways of thought of the ruling elite. But of course, they are very limited. For one thing, this is a very narrow group of people, a very narrow group in terms of its social origin. But more important, the consultas of the Council of State rarely give any insight into broader attitudes and thinking. The councillors of state were most of the time wrestling with very specific pressing immediate issues with no time to spare for wider contextualization or meditation. I'm very interested to know whether any of you have different experiences in your reading of the official record of this period. So what should we do then to discover attitudes towards politics in Spain in this period? I think we have to identify a wider range of sources where a broader sector of the population was interrogated or interviewed or otherwise articulated a general worldview. And here I'm thinking of things like Inquisition cases, where among the general interrogation, views are articulated about the individual's view of the broader society and politics, or petitions to the king, or wills or testaments. And where the source does not immediately or obviously articulate a broad view of what might be called the political situation, we might want to adopt the method of what has been called reading against the grain in order to tease out the political implication of the source. Okay, it's time I turn to the concept of the polycentric monarchy. In recent years, the notion that the Spanish monarchy was polycentric has gained widespread acceptance. This new concept has been developed in large part as an alternative to, on the one hand, the older Weberian idea of a centralized and centralizing state, but also on the other hand, to John Eliot's hitherto very influential suggestion that the same collection of territories, the global Spanish monarchy, should be regarded as, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, a composite state. Now, this is an important new insight with significant implications for the relationship between the various parts of the monarchy, for its identity and for its functioning. Now, I'm tempted to say that it helps explain the failure of the Messina revolt of the 1670s, since Messina's long-running rival centre in Sicily, Palermo, failed to support the revolt. So this rivalry of centres within Sicily explains the triumph of the authorities in Madrid over the Messina revolt. Now, of course, others might argue against me that it was Sicily's polycentricity, if I can put it that way, which produced the revolt in the first place. That enmity between Palermo and Messina actually helped bring about the initial revolt. Now, this ambiguity suggests that the concept or method needs further refining. One thing we might want to think about is whether centres are simply thought of as geographical entities, cities and territories or regions, or might institutions, corporations be thought of as centres? For example, the Mesta. Was there a hierarchy of centres? And how did the various centres see and relate to each other? I was privileged recently to be allowed to read an essay that Cinzia Cremonini of Milan will soon publish on the unique position of Madrid as the location of the royal court. Its unique position above the various vice-regal courts throughout the monarchy. At the heart of her essay is the book Solo Madrid es Corte by Alonso Núñez de Castro, originally published in Madrid in 1658, but went significantly into its third edition in 1698. Now, what was the significance of that third edition and the year it was produced? Was it a reaction against a perceived decline in the face of the transformation of the empire, the monarchy, into a polycentric polity? Was Madrid being bypassed as other centres established connections independently of the capital. So how many of these centers were there? Was Burgos, a Cortes voting town, a center in the same way as was Mexico City, a seat of viceregal government? Various other questions suggest themselves. What was the local response in these centers to crises at court in Madrid? What speculation was there any, in Milan, in Cagliari, in Lima, in 1669 to the fall of Nitar, in 1676-77 to the coup which toppled Valenzuela, to the dismissal of Oropesa in 1691. You get the idea. But more important, especially for a historian of late Habsburg Spain, who has for some decades been drawing on the riches of Simancas, is the question, what does the polycentric model mean for the conciliar system of the Habsburgs? Now, those many councils sitting in Madrid have traditionally been seen as the hub of the global monarchy. But the system is frequently dismissed as ineffective and soon to be abandoned by the first Bourbon, Philip V. But I want to suggest that the polycentric model vindicates the role of those central councils, not so much as agents for imposing the will of the center on the periphery, but as the crucial point for gathering information and for negotiation with the many centers, and consequently for the coordination of policy and strategy across the whole monarchy. Now, I suspect some of you may be thinking this is not such a new insight, that in reality, we have long understood the councils in the way I am arguing, or perhaps stressing a little more fully. But we do need, I think, to acknowledge the role of the councils and to ensure that they enjoy their rightful place in this new model of the polycentric monarchy. Their role was most evident, I think, in times of crisis, which we tend to think of means time of war. But it might also be at time of a natural disaster. It seems to be a very appropriate thing to bear in mind right now at the time of the COP. So what did Lima, one center, know of the earthquake at Malaga, another center, in 1680? What did Malaga know of the Lima earthquake of 1687? I don't know to what extent there was any particular interest or even awareness of this latter disaster, the Lima earthquake of 1687, in, for example, Naples or Brussels or even Burgos. But there was in conciliar circles in Madrid and, of course, Seville with its connection to the Indies. And it would be here where some effort might be made to draw on what we think of as institutional memory, by which I mean, of course, the archives, and on the experience of other similar disasters in the past, and to coordinate across the monarchy, if necessary, appropriate emergency relief measures. But the polycentric model also, I think, obliges us to look at what else bound or might bind the many centers outside Madrid to the court, especially where the sale of office, venality, was loosening the control exercised from Madrid, not least, of course, in the distant Americas. Now, this is where the approach of those for whom the crucial cement of the monarchy was Mercedes comes into play. This distribution of Mercedes has long been seen as a very important means of binding subjects, regions to the monarchy. One consequence, of course, of this seems to me a little bit paradoxical, is that Madrid, or the court at the center of the Iberian Peninsula, was expanding as the urban elites of towns like Burgos, Valladolid, and so on, were actually being rewarded with honors at court. They were becoming part of the court center, possibly at the expense of their local center. But I think that is a matter possibly for debate. We also need to recognize the role of those many agents at court in Madrid, sent and maintained by their communities, the various Cortes voting towns, for example, and who sent home frequent reports of the progress of the matters they were negotiating in Madrid on behalf of their home communities. And so they're expanding what we might think of as a representative community in Madrid, which is not a diplomatic community. Their presence also raises or makes clear the importance of communications and also the control of the postal system, something I don't think we pay enough attention to. Okay, so I've been talking about the councils, and membership of the Council of State was, broadly speaking, the preserve of those with experience at the highest level of those peripheral territories, and meant another link between them and the court. Now, we're really talking here about the titulos and grandees, which is what I want to talk about now. The historiography respecting this group has traditionally been very, very critical, very negative, seeing titulos and grandees as selfish and factious, pursuing power and its rewards at the expense of the best interests of the monarchy. But a different perspective allows us to be more positive. And here I want to draw on a historiography relating to medieval England, where political disorder, and I have in mind the civil wars of the 15th century that we know as the Wars of the Roses, has been attributed to weakness at the top, i.e. the weak character of the king. Now, on the whole, I think the positive contribution of Carlos II as adult ruler from 1675 has been neglected by historians, but clearly at certain points in the reign, there was a vacuum at the heart of government that Spain's nobility had to cope with as best it could, and I would suggest did reasonably well. Of course, there were contests for power, but that was true of elites everywhere in Europe. And one of the things I think that we neglect is the existence of what I would call a service nobility. And I think we neglect this service nobility in part because what we seem to be most aware of is the growth in the number of titled nobles by means of venality, by sale of titles. That is where the main focus has been in recent decades. But I think it means we ignore these people who obtain titles by means of service. Now, this service nobility was particularly evident among the lesser untitled nobles, the hidalgos and caballeros, and examples include Don Luis de Borja y Centelles, wounded at the Battle of Landen in Flanders in 1693 during the 9 Years' War, and who in 1700 petitioned that he be excused payment of the media annata on a grant of 1,000 escudos he had received from the king in reward for his services. Now, many of these men were rewarded with a title, and indicative of this is the number of titled nobles petitioning for exemption from, for example, a donativo demanded of all titulos by the king in 1695, and they're seeking exemption on the grounds of their military service. And many of them are granted exemption because they are actually serving at that time. And we need to identify more fully the number and size of this group. And what we need here, again, I'm thinking about method, thinking about what Manuel told me this session should be about, is to construct a database of regional or center, on the basis of regions or centers, a database of the nobility, and to construct individual biographies and careers in order to get a clearer sense of the whole of this group. Now, in addition, too many nobles are dismissed in the historiography as incompetent and worse, when in fact, as I've already indicated, they're simply trying to do their best in challenging circumstances. Now, I just want to give a few examples of the sort of individual I have in mind. So let's take the Conde de Fuensalida, who served successively as Viceroy or Captain General between 1676 and 1691 of Navarra, Galicia, Sardinia, and Lombardy. His career was cut short when he was recalled from Milan in 1691 and replaced by the Marqués de Leganés. Fuensalida's disgrace followed the complaints of Spain's new ally, the Duke of Savoy, who was backed in Madrid by another of Spain's then allies, William III. It was thought that Fuensalida had not been supportive enough of the Duke of Savoy, but this complaint failed to acknowledge the other responsibilities in Milan of Fuensalida, who had proved a very successful Captain General hitherto, and who in 1689 had seized an opportunity of French difficulties to seize the fortress of Guastalla and enhance the security of Milan. Significantly, Leganés was to face some of the same challenges that Fuensalida had faced in Milan before 1691. But individuals of this caliber were evident elsewhere in the global monarchy. Let's take another example, the Conde de Lemos, the Viceroy of Peru, who died there in 1672. He showed great energy in seeking to reform the system of forced native Indian labor in Peru, the system we know as the mita. That he did not entirely succeed does not negate his effort and ability. Now, more generally, the records of the Council of State that I've already referred to don't reveal a selfish, factional struggle for power, certainly not an open one. What they do reveal are intelligent men wrestling with the challenges of the global monarchy at a time of scarce resources and drawing in most cases on relevant experience in the field and some of them at sea in various parts of the monarchy. I would just add here, thinking again about method and approach, that reflecting the upsurge of interest in the last generation and the role of women in the past, we're now far more aware of the positive role played by noble women. As wives accompanying their husbands, so for example, the Condesa de Lemos not only accompanied her husband to Peru, but acted as de facto viceroy when he headed into the interior of Peru to resolve difficulties there. But they also acted as wives, remaining at home while their husbands were absent as viceroys, generals, and governors, managing the estate, maintaining contacts with key figures at court, or as widows, raising children who were minors, and again, looking after the estate. As with their menfolk, the construction of databases of basic biographies should help us identify more of these women, while their letters, some of which has been published. One example is the correspondence of Doña Elvira de Toledo, Condesa de Galve, who corresponded with her brother-in-law, the Duke of Pastrana and Infantado, during her husband's period of office as Viceroy of Mexico between 1688 and 1696. And this correspondence of these noble women should reveal a great deal about the public life, their public and private persona in this period. Okay, I'm going to come to a conclusion you will be delighted to learn. I'm very aware that I've only scratched the surface of the political culture of an enormous and complex global polity. We're talking about a global collection of territories, which is almost impossible to reduce, to encapsulate in any simple formulation. But I hope I suggested some interesting new ways of thinking about the Spain of Carlos II, and also some useful, effective methods or approaches for exploring it further. Thinking about what the whole held the whole together, I wonder if for the elites, and of course, we're always talking about the elites, the big challenge for us must be to try and find out more about attitudes and behaviors below the level of the elites. But for the elites, rule from Madrid was possibly, and this is the best explanation for loyalty to Carlos II and Madrid, was that rule from Madrid was the least worst option. Louis XIV may not have been as absolute as the traditional historiography suggests, but for many throughout the Spanish monarchy, rule from Madrid was certainly preferable to rule from Versailles, or even, thinking about other alternatives, rule from Turin, the rule of the Duke of Savoy. I thought I might also finish with one final suggestion for future research. Applying the biographical or generational method of research. So my question is, what were the qualities which were required to succeed in politics under Carlos II? Now, in order to answer this question, I think we need studies of individual careers, individual biographies of a number of people who all reached adulthood around 1660 or 1670 and who prospered throughout the reign, surviving all the different regimes of the Validos. And we would use this data in order to see just how they had survived and prospered and what their success across those different governing regimes reveals about the political culture of the reign of Carlos II. Well, thank you for your attention, your indulgence, and finally, your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Storrs. Muchísimas gracias, Profesor Storrs, por esta visión tan completa y tan interesante sobre la cultura política en la España de Carlos II. Y esta... ¿Está grabando, no? Sí. No. Y esta última pregunta, ¿no? ¿Qué cualidades se necesitaban para triunfar en política en la época de Carlos II? Esta pregunta que ha lanzado ahí y que queda abierta a futuras investigaciones. Si hay, como hemos dicho antes, si hay alguna pregunta concreta o alguna duda que alguien quiera hacer, si no, podemos hacer una pausa de 5 o 10 minutos, continuamos con Juan Sánchez, con nuestro próximo conferenciante, y después hacemos un debate general en el que unamos las dos ponencias, si os parece. ¿De acuerdo? Bueno, no hay entonces ninguna pregunta. Bueno, pues entonces ahora hacemos un descanso de 5 o 10 minutos. Muchísimas gracias y volvemos
Muchísimas gracias.
A seguir ahora con nuestro segundo conferenciante. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.